In the winter of 1942, deep in the heart of war-torn Europe, German soldiers first encountered a strange new weapon in the hands of American infantrymen. It was small, it was crude-looking, but it was devastatingly effective. The Germans had faced tanks, artillery, and the thunder of Allied bombers. But what truly stunned them was this shoulder-fired rocket launcher, nicknamed the Bazooka, for Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. It became more than a curiosity. It was hailed as one of the decisive tools of victory, a weapon that gave ordinary foot soldiers the power to level the playing field against the mighty German panzer divisions. The Bazooka was, in many ways, a child of desperation and ingenuity. When the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, its infantry units were painfully underprepared to fight heavily armored opponents. German tanks like the Panzer IV and later the fearsome Tiger rolled across Europe with almost impunity. Conventional rifles and machine guns bounced harmlessly off their thick armor. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy, cumbersome, and difficult to maneuver on the fast-moving battlefields of the 1940s. What the infantry needed was something portable, powerful, and simple enough to put into the hands of ordinary soldiers. The answer came from a fusion of two ideas: the shaped charge explosive, capable of penetrating armor with a focused blast, and a rocket-propelled projectile that could be launched without heavy artillery. In 1942, U.S. Army engineers, led by Colonel Leslie Skinner and Captain Edward Uhl, began experimenting with handheld rocket launchers. Legend has it that the prototype was cobbled together in just 48 hours, using scrap tubing and spare parts, a contraption that looked so crude it was compared to a child's musical instrument. In fact, it was named after a popular radio comedian, Bob Burns, who played a homemade musical horn called the Bazooka. The name stuck, and soon this strange device would be etched into military history. By mid-1942, the first M1 bazookas were being shipped to American troops. They were roughly 5 feet long, weighed about 13 pounds, and fired a 2.36-inch rocket with a shaped charge warhead. To fire it, 2 men were required, one to aim and pull the trigger, the other to load the rocket into the open tube. The backblast made it dangerous to fire in confined spaces, but in the open field, it gave infantry a weapon they had never possessed before, a chance to stop a tank dead in its tracks. The Germans first encountered the bazooka in North Africa during the Tunisian campaign. Rommel's Afrika Korps, used to brushing aside lightly armed infantry, suddenly found themselves facing squads of GIs who could knock out a panzer with a single shot. Reports quickly made their way back to Berlin. At first, German commanders dismissed the weapon as crude and unreliable. But as more and more tanks were lost to this shoulder-fired menace, attitudes changed. German intelligence officers secured captured examples and sent them back for analysis. The reaction was one of shock and admiration. Here was a simple, effective design that cost almost nothing to produce compared to the complex engineering of a Panzer. Almost overnight, German engineers began work on their own version. The infamous Panzerschreck, a larger, deadlier copy that would later haunt Allied tank crews. Meanwhile, in the hands of American infantry, the bazooka was rewriting battlefield tactics. In Sicily, in Italy, and later in France, Eisenhower recognized its impact. Before the bazooka, infantry often had to rely on calling in artillery or waiting for their own tanks to arrive to deal with German armor. With the bazooka, a small squad could ambush a tank column, turning the balance of power. Eisenhower reportedly referred to it as one of the weapons of victory, placing it alongside the Sherman tank and the P-51 Mustang as tools that allowed the Allies to keep pace with the German war machine. The bazooka was not without flaws. The early M1 model was temperamental, often misfiring in wet conditions. Its rockets had limited range, effective at less than 100 yards, and accuracy was questionable at best. Many soldiers learned the hard way that the safest way to use it was up close, often firing from concealed positions just yards away from a moving tank. This demanded enormous courage. Stories spread of American soldiers waiting in ditches or behind hedgerows, holding their fire until a German tank rumbled past, then unleashing a rocket into its vulnerable side or rear armor. It was dangerous, desperate work, but when it succeeded, it was spectacular. As the war ground on, the bazooka became a symbol of the gritty determination of the American infantrymen. During the D-Day invasion and the brutal hedgerow fighting in Normandy, bazooka teams prowled the fields and villages, turning the tide in countless small engagements. German accounts describe the shock of seeing their armored spearheads blunted, not by artillery, but by lone squads of soldiers wielding these strange tubular launchers. To the Germans it seemed almost unfair. An infantryman, with no heavy equipment, could now destroy a tank worth tens of thousands of Reichsmarks. By 1943 and 1944, the bazooka had already inspired a global arms race. The Germans improved on the design with the Panzerschreck, which fired a larger 80 mm rocket capable of piercing the thickest Allied armor. The Soviets developed their own equivalents, drawing inspiration from both American and German designs. In this sense, the bazooka was not just a weapon, it was a revolution in infantry warfare. It marked the beginning of an age when soldiers on foot could challenge armored vehicles. A concept that continues into modern times with weapons like the RPG and the Javelin missile. Eisenhower, ever the pragmatic commander, valued the bazooka not just for its tactical uses but for its psychological effect. To American troops, it offered hope. The sight of German tanks no longer meant helpless retreat or annihilation. With a bazooka slung over the shoulder, a soldier could face down steel giants and win. Morale soared. For the Germans, however, it was a rude awakening. They prided themselves on technological superiority, on their tanks being the undisputed kings of the battlefield. The bazooka shattered that illusion. Suddenly, every hedgerow, every ruined farmhouse, every corner of a city street might conceal a bazooka team ready to strike. The bazooka's impact was not limited to tanks. Soldiers quickly discovered it could demolish bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortified positions. In the dense urban fighting of Aachen, Metz, and later in the Battle of the Bulge, bazookas blasted holes through walls and buildings, clearing the way for infantry assaults. It became a multi-purpose weapon, feared by anyone on the receiving end of its rockets. German soldiers wrote in letters and diaries of their dread of the bazooka, describing the terrifying whoosh of the rocket leaving the tube and the devastating explosion that followed. Perhaps the most telling sign of the bazooka's significance was how rapidly the Germans sought to replicate it. The Panzerschreck, introduced in 1943, was almost a direct copy, enlarged to fire an 88 mm rocket. It had greater range and penetration, but required a protective shield to protect the operator from backblast. It was heavy and unwieldy compared to the American bazooka, but it was deadly effective. Eisenhower himself noted this in later writings, acknowledging that the bazooka had not only equipped American troops with a new weapon, but had forced the enemy to change its tactics and designs. In effect, the bazooka had set the tone for the infantry versus armor struggle of the later war years. By the time American forces pushed into Germany in 1945, the bazooka was everywhere. Thousands had been produced, carried by infantry squads across Europe and the Pacific. Against Japanese bunkers and pillboxes, it was just as effective as it had been against German tanks. Marines used it to blast open cave entrances in the islands of the Pacific, proving its versatility across every theater of the war. For Eisenhower and the Allied High Command, it was clear that this humble, almost comical-looking tube had played a crucial role in leveling the battlefield. When the war ended, the legacy of the bazooka continued. It had proven that simple, cost-effective weapons could have an outsized impact. Its influence spread worldwide, inspiring countless post-war designs. The Germans may have been stunned by Eisenhower's weapon of victory, but they were not alone. Military planners everywhere took note. The age of the infantryman armed with rocket power had arrived. In reflecting on the war years, Eisenhower placed the bazooka among the critical innovations that enabled the Allies to triumph. It was not the most glamorous of weapons. It was not as celebrated as the B-17 bomber or the Sherman tank. But in the mud, the snow, and the rubble where soldiers fought face-to-face with the enemy, it mattered. For the men who carried it, it was a lifeline. For the Germans who faced it, it was a nightmare. And for history, it was proof that sometimes the simplest inventions can change the course of a global conflict. The story of the bazooka is, in many ways, the story of World War II itself, a clash of ingenuity, courage, and adaptation. Born in the urgency of war, improvised from scraps, and dismissed at first as a gimmick, it grew into a weapon that shook the foundations of German battlefield dominance. It empowered the ordinary soldier to strike back against overwhelming odds, and in doing so, it helped secure the path to Allied victory. The Germans were indeed stunned, and Eisenhower's so-called weapon of victory earned its place in the arsenal of history.